Donald Trump making no secret of his future plans. He wants revenge on his enemies, and he's considering another run for the presidency in 2024. But he can't do either if he's in jail. Now, on Monday, the Supreme Court finally ruled on a key Trump tax return case, ordering Trump's accountants to turn over his tax returns and other data to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. They complied that same day. But last year, the New York Times published excerpts from a similar set of Trump returns, and it didn't look like they contained any bombshells. We learned that he paid zero in federal income taxes in 11 of 18 years, and he paid only $750 in taxes in 2016 and 17. Not a good look, to put it politely, but not necessarily illegal. But DA Cy Vance, he got more than just Trump's returns. He also got a slew of additional supporting documents, things like financial statements and reports, even documents from independent auditors. So what does that tell us about the investigation and where it may be headed, and just how much legal trouble is Donald Trump likely to be in on this one of about a half a dozen active criminal investigations into his actions? Can't think of a better guest to ask that to than the Honorable Shira Scheindlin. Judge Scheindlin, she spent 22 years on the federal bench in the Southern District of New York before retiring in 2016. Okay, so I think the headline everybody says, okay, Vance is going to get his hands on 8 years of Trump's tax returns, but it's much more involved than that. Give an idea to our audience, in addition to the returns, what really is Vance trying to find from these that'll really dictate where his case goes?
Well, so there's a couple questions I have to answer there. He doesn't just get 8 years of tax returns. What he gets is all of the accounting records that the accounting firm has. And that's really important to understand. He gets the underlying documents that they worked with in order to prepare the tax returns. So the DA gets a look at all of those business records that then get moved into a tax return. And what the DA then has to do is to see whether the information was used differently for different purposes. For example, with properties, were they overvalued when they wanted to get a loan, but undervalued when you want to prepare a tax return and avoid paying taxes? So there's a lot of work to do. And as I understand it, it totals to millions, literally millions of pages that have to be reviewed.
And that helps explain a little bit why some of the folks have been brought onto the team with forensic tax experience. But in a layman's perspective, Your Honor, they're really trying to show intent, aren't they, as to what Trump and team were trying to do, not just with evaluations, but also a pattern in what they did year after year to basically defraud the state and everyone else out of a lot of these tax revenues.
Well, that's right. These are difficult cases, but they're looking to make possibly a tax fraud case, possibly a bank fraud case, defrauding a bank into giving a loan, bankruptcy fraud case, declaring bankruptcy when it wasn't appropriate or giving false information to the court. So there's bank fraud, insurance fraud. I didn't even mention that one, insurance fraud, tax fraud. There's a number of different kinds of fraud cases that could be made here. These aren't easy to make because you can't work only with documents. You really end up needing a witness or more who can explain the documents and can explain the intent of the person who was actually doing the filing, which here was former President Trump.
Yeah, and I've also heard falsifying records could also be a potential charge he's looking at. You've got a lot of balls up in the air at the same time, not just what Cy Vance's office is doing. Obviously, the Attorney General in New York has a case. I've heard from folks that, who knows, between the Mueller probe, what got farmed out to maybe some of the district offices, including your old stomping grounds. How is this, or is it at all, coordinated? I'm not even talking about what's going on in Georgia and other places, Judge. Do they talk to one another? Do they try to make sure they don't step on each other's toes and that they're coherent?
There's some coordination, but not really, because you can look at different crimes. There could be federal crimes that couldn't be prosecuted by the state. So, for example, if there are violations of the campaign finance laws, which after all was the original indictment against Michael Cohen having to do with Stormy Daniels, that'll be on the federal side. That's not a state crime, the campaign finance stuff. But the insurance fraud that I mentioned, the bank fraud, could be prosecuted by either. So to the extent that some of the crimes could be federal or state, there has to be some communication. But the major investigation here is in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and they put together a big team. They've hired FTI Consulting to do the forensic work on the tax papers. They brought on Mark Pomerantz, a very experienced federal prosecutor, to assist in the review of the papers and theoretically what the crimes could be. So they've got a big effort going.
You know, somebody said a line I liked. It's not like Trump sat on a laptop with TurboTax here. There's a lot of layers in between him and the filings. But to me, and help me out, I think a name we're going to hear a lot of is Alan Weisselberg, who was at Mazars. The guys who put this together, I got to think they're going to be really motivated, you know, when the screws get put to them potentially, if they're the ones who put their signatures when they filed this, that maybe they're going to cooperate.
Maybe so. So one of the things all prosecutors try to do is what's called flip a witness. So if a witness believes that they could be the target of a criminal indictment, they're often say, hey, I don't need this. I'm going to cooperate. I'm going to testify against the real wrongdoer. So it is possible that if the accountants have any exposure, somebody could flip and testify. But, you know, an accountant's in a strange position. You can only work with the papers you're given. So depending what they knew and what they didn't know, it may still rest on what they were given by Trump or the Trump organization.
All of this comes as the clock's ticking for soon. Trump's going to have, as we understand it, at least a $400 million note that's due. I know one of the things that we're looking here is, could there be any foreign bank accounts that were undisclosed as required by law, et cetera? How much of the mystery as to who has been underwriting so much of Trump's businesses for so long, how does that get involved into this, and what we may or may not learn from the millions of documents, as you said, that are now in Cy Vance's hands?
Well, you know, some of this we already knew. We knew that with a lot of the real estate deals he did, he was financed by entities and people in Russia. This was no secret. This was known before. And you also remember that the New York Times got a hold of 8 years of tax returns and did a whole expose shortly before the election, which showed that Trump paid very little in taxes. So we already had some idea of what's going to be found in this careful review. But I think what we're going to see is even more ability to look behind the tax documents to the underlying documents that I started out saying. So we're going to learn who really financed him. We know Deutsche Bank was his bank. We know the Russians had invested in his real estate. We're going to learn more as time goes by. Now, when I say we're going to learn more, not exactly so. This is a grand jury investigation. So the public does not get to see these papers. The DA does, the grand jury does, but then if there are indictments of anyone, it becomes a public trial.
You mentioned the public, and you also mentioned that Times reporting, for which I believe won a Pulitzer. You and I might have been some of a handful of folks who actually got through that 16,000-page story. It was fascinating, but the point is, I don't think it resonated that much with the public because of the denseness of it. Do you think at the end of this, Your Honor, I know we're talking months before this thing even gets going, but the public's going to get their arms around how Trump really did business, and if in fact he committed fraud on various levels, it's going to be consumable. And at the end of the day, just how much trouble could he be in?
Oh, he could be in a lot of trouble, to get to your last question first. But to get to the earlier questions, I think the one thing that did resonate from the New York Times expose, not the 16,000 words, but there was one headline that he paid either no taxes for year after year or $750 in taxes. And I don't know about you, but my strong guess is you paid more, and I know I paid more. And that's what people did relate to. So I think that, again, is going to come out. I think the public will understand things such as valuations that are high for one purpose and low for another. I think that's not that hard to grasp. So some of the complicated things that might have been done here, certain depreciation, things like that, that's difficult. But the simple idea that you value a property one way for one purpose and a different way for another, that everyone can understand. Now, as to how much trouble he could be in, if there's really indictments, a lot of these charges carry significant penalties, such as 5 years in jail, 10 years in jail. So theoretically, and I do say theoretically because these cases, I said, first of all, are hard to bring and hard to prove, and then sentencing is not always at those numbers. But it could result theoretically in significant time in jail.
We shall see. I always appreciate you breaking it down for us, Shira Scheindlin. Judge, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, if he can stay out of jail, and as you just heard, that's a big if, we know that Donald Trump wants a political future in the Republican Party. He's considering conservatives at this weekend's CPAC conference. Well, they just wheeled in a golden statue of the Donald to worship to. It seems his control of the party remains mostly unquestioned. So we'll question it next.